Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of ISA's Bookshelf. This is a new podcast series brought to you by Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. In this series, we'll be discussing latest books on various aspects of South Asia, from social, economic, political, and international, with the authors who wrote those books. I'm your host, Sandeep Bhardwaj. And I'm so glad that we are kicking off this series with Dr. Avinash Paliwal, who has recently written the book India's Near East, A New History. This is a sweeping account of New Delhi's attempt to grapple with the twin challenges of managing its northeast, while at the same time dealing with its eastern neighbors, Bangladesh and Myanmar. Avinash is a reader of international relations at SOAS UK, and he is also a non-resident fellow at ISAS. And he also previously wrote a fascinating book on India's role in Afghanistan called My Enemy's Enemy. Avinash, welcome and congratulations on the book, which I understand is now a year old already.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandeep. It's truly an honor to be here.
So let's just jump into the book. Before getting into with the empirical story of this sweeping narrative that you have put together, let me start with the mechanics of the book itself. This is a very broadly conceived book in both space, because it starts from decolonization, comes up to present day, and it's also in time because it covers the entire northeast of India and in Bangladesh and Myanmar. And I suppose the obvious question to start with is, why did you decide this idea? Why did you think that this was a unified region? And also at the same time, do you think that from your analytical perspective, it made sense? Did you also see New Delhi seeing it as a unified region, or did they see it as a broken apart pieces which didn't come together the way you saw it?
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you for that excellent question. Now, let me first start with saying that this was a book that was, the journey of this book began as effectively a bilateral relationship, a history of bilateral relationship between India and Myanmar. And I think it's during that journey of trying to unpack that bilateral relationship, having unpacked India's relationship or approach towards Afghanistan in my first book, that led me to India's Near East. Just writing a book about India's relations with Myanmar, at some point during that journey stopped making sense. And this is where the idea of India's Near East for me took birth, right? That there is a need to understand at an analytical level what the interconnections are there between India's northeastern states, West Bengal, Bangladesh, or as it was known as East Pakistan before 1971, and of course Burma, or as it's now called over the past few decades, Myanmar, and to make sense of this region, not just in terms of appreciating its kind of social diversity and richness and interconnections, but also the disruptive energies that continue to can continue to define this region, right? Whether it is this anti-foreigner or anti-outsider kind of sentiment in Assam, whether it's the politics of secularism or communism in Bengal previously, whether it is this kind of debate between Joy Bangla or secular Bangladeshi nationalism and the more conservative kind of Islamic Bangladeshi nationalism, and similar debates in Burma, where the union is trying to kind of cohere or trying to cohere around this idea of a very top-down union with state religion being Buddhism, but the reality on the ground being very diverse. There are many communities which are not Buddhist. So you're looking with states which have been created afresh in 1947-48, and they are trying to struggle with this concept of statehood. And this is what really kind of, triggered this project in some sense, is that it has to be understood in a unified manner, not because I'm searching for unity, but it just does not make sense in the silos that exist both in literature and on the ground. So that's where the Near East, the idea of Near East came in, and that's when it became, the primary purpose of this book is, as you said, to understand these twin challenges of domestic state building and foreign policy in India's neighborhood, in India's region, so to say. It's, in my perspective, it's a geopolitical history in inverse, insofar as I try to look at how India went about building itself, state building or nation building, in parts of Northeast India and parts of, earlier Assam, which was a much bigger entity than it is today, by using, how did it build its contract among populations, among demographies, among communities who were resisting the idea of the Constitution of India, who were resisting the idea about being part of this larger union called India, when they wanted their own separate nationhood, like the Naga communities come to mind, for example, or later the Mizo communities who were resisting the state. How did India build its state? By looking at it from an outside-in lens. What was happening in East Pakistan or later Bangladesh and in Burma, but also how did India's kind of regional rivals, especially China and Pakistan, were dealing with these kind of vulnerabilities? How does that shape India's kind of anxieties and aspirations to build itself in the Northeast? Similarly, the other aspect of the inverse geopolitical history is to look at India's sort of, foreign policy making in the region inside out. A lot of India's own domestic kind of constraints and kind of aspirations in northeast of India would shape its approach, foreign policy approaches towards Dhaka or Pakistan before 1971, a unified Pakistan, and towards Beijing. How do you deal with them? How do you, and of course, towards Rangoon or Naypyidaw today. So trying to unpack these two relationship is really kind of got me started. And there was also a literary need for this, right? This is a conversation which has not been had in that comprehensive a manner, in my view. There is, in fact, literature on this region is not scarce. There's a very rich body of literature on different aspects, different disciplines. It was finding connections between those disciplines as much as these countries to make sense of this very complicated and, as I call, one of the most partitioned, politically partitioned regions anywhere on this planet.
No, I get that. And I also understand that. I mean, of course, it is a region which only in 1930s and 40s get partitioned. Before that, there was some sort of a unity of political economic unity that existed. But from a methodological standpoint, it's also a very audacious task to, try to combine domestic and foreign. And I imagine that, you do it brilliantly, but I imagine that there were a lot of risk or a lot of pitfalls as a researcher that you had to avoid. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of challenges that you thought came up while trying to do this a rather unique experiment of trying to combine these two things, domestic and foreign policy?
Absolutely, Sandeep. There was a moment in this when I was writing this book when I had to take a call whether to continue writing it or not. And that was precisely because of the daunting kind of methodological risks that I could see in front of me when I was trying to kind of unpack kind of connect too many things and try to put that in a coherent narrative. I'm glad I persisted, but it was not easy. Now, the first and foremost risk was whether this was a project for a historian or will it become a project for a theoretician, right? And it was very clear in my mind that even though theory and concepts are very important in guiding history, it's the craft of history. It cannot be disconnected from concepts and theories. This would be a historian's piece rather than a international relations theoretician's piece. So that imparted certain degree of kind of clarity to me that the empirics, the story will hold its ground if it's organized in a conceptually kind of sound fashion. Now, then the second, so that challenge of how to balance the two, that decision was taken pretty early on. The second methodological risk, then is there is a risk of overlap when you look at very powerful foreign policy narratives, processes, and then you look at equally powerful domestic political processes and economic processes, right? There is a risk of overlap in terms of you identify a moment in this larger canvas of historical canvas and you say that, okay, perhaps this decision or non-decision was taken or not taken because of, let's say, external factors. But the reality could be different. It could be primarily driven by domestic needs rather than anything external, even though it's couched as external. And I saw that quite a lot happen, a lot of it happening during the course of the research of this book. I'll give you a very quick example. When India decided to sign the boundary treaty, the border treaty with Myanmar or Burma in 1967, this has traditionally been understood as a decision taken primarily to stabilize relationship with Burma, but also a signal to China at that point in time. And we are talking peak Cultural Revolution China, so quite aggressive China. When you start looking into the minutiae of that decision making, however, you realize that while protecting India's relationship and equities with post-coup Burma was important, uh, the the decision from India's side was driven primarily to assert the writ of the state in northeast of India. So this was a domestically driven decision, even though, of course, there were external kind of positive equities accruing to it as far as that was concerned. So putting adequate analytical or accurate analytical weight to one of these two, or to balance, which one, what is the more pressing causal driver at a particular point in time, that becomes difficult. So that is the second challenge, and that was a constant challenge when I was doing this book, writing the book. The last challenge was, as you have read the book, there are four themes that drive my analysis, right? Identity politics. It's all four themes are understood expansively, but with care. Identity politics, cross-border migration, regional political economies, and official antinomies or contradictions, right? India wants to do something, but something else happens as part of its decision-making choices. Uh, why these four themes? Why not something else? And one of the biggest kind of question mark for me was why not India's electoral politics? Indian elections, Indian democracy is so important a driver, and electoral needs as we know today is so important and has always been in some senses important. Why not that as a causal driver as well? And that's when the choices really kick in. The book appreciates India's electoral dynamics, but does not give it that kind of analytical primacy, because I feel that those dynamics can be covered well enough within the narrative of the book, but also in the four categories that I have kind of established, right? And this is where, again, that's a methodological choice. The risk there is, do you understand India's politics changing only during electoral cycles or not? And my feeling in India's East was that while elections, state elections or national elections are very important, that's not the only story in town. There's something else also. And that's why I also kind of chose to keep that in the narrative, but not give it kind of analytical primacy in terms of making it a theme, a standalone theme in itself. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And as along with that, there's also the thing that this is a very well-researched book, while it is also a very gripping narrative. Um, but I think the expansion also goes not just in terms of the scope and the space that you're looking at, but also in terms of your characters. Because usually these kind of stories are very New Delhi centric and very PMO centric at that. You end up with a story which is basically just Prime Minister and their close aides and MEA officials. But you bring in a lot of different actors into the story, and that also speaks to your theory of how policy is made. So could you speak about that a little bit?
Yes, I think one caveat I should mention, Sandeep, this is, in my view, look, I'm a scholar trained in international relations, which is, of course, a discipline within the wider kind of rubric of political science. So my training has, I mean, focus on state and kind of government officials who form part of the state, whether it's in India or in Bangladesh, Myanmar, that comes very naturally to me. And I'm quite conscious that that should not only be the case when driving analysis. In some senses, this book is still a history of how India's states deal with complexities on the ground, whether they have adequate knowledge, how their biases play out, right? There's a lot of biases. We can talk about the specific examples of that, but how is it that New Delhi make sense of its own self, of its own country, and approach it, right? So in some senses, I am guilty of the charge that the book does give some degree of primacy to the state, but as a scholar, as an analyst who's kind of very acutely aware that decisions in Delhi or in any capital, right, they are made with partial information and a lot of bias at times, and very different interest sets, right? Your interest in doing something has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on the ground at times, much more in the politics of, let's say, New Delhi in the bubble. So that's where the local regional narratives from the grounds up become very, very important. These are not to be treated in some sense. This is not a top-down, bottoms-up thing, right? Those narratives are actually very important because when whatever policy directive comes from Delhi travels that far, it changes in its quality, and its implementation is very different in reality, right? So I wanted to make sure that regional interlocutors, regional economic interests, both in political entities, whether it's in Assam or Manipur or Mizoram or Nagaland or elsewhere, or for Dhaka, whether it's in the Chittagong Hill Tracts or in the Kachin areas for Myanmar or Karen areas, those voices are given the due respect that they deserve across the book. That is something which I've strove for throughout the narrative, and to really say that look, there are community dynamics which are beyond the control of New Delhi and will almost always be beyond the control of New Delhi to a certain extent, even moving forward, and they have to be understood on their own merit. So if you ask me in terms of character cast, the intelligence history speaks a lot more. Suddenly, Indian spies. I mean, if we, in my view, India's intelligence history is a very underdeveloped field, and I think the spies deserve that kind of intellectual kind of appreciation. Whether you criticize them for what they do or you kind of support them, that's a different matter. But they play a very important role in executing. They're very important in instrumentalizing India's foreign policy choices, especially in the neighborhood. So that's the state, the government officials, the bureaucracy, the business interests. These are the broad category in one, and then are the regional interlocutors. And the third category of actors could be the community members who are being affected by these.
So, and I think that the book is much richer because there are so many cast of characters that show up there. Although, keeping track of some of them becomes very difficult in the book because it's such a vast scope. And I don't think, if we turn to the actual history that you cover in the book, I don't think we can do justice to all of it. It's so vast. But let me pick up a couple of threads. So, I think we can start with Burma, which is one of the interesting points that you start with at the time of independence. That in one of the episodes that you highlight is India's involvement in Burmese Civil War immediately after in decolonization of South Asia. And the Indian intervention, which is basically very military in its nature, is very different from the kind of usual Nehruvian foreign policy that we hear about pan-Asianism and non-alignment. So how does India get involved in the Civil War, and what does it tell us about the larger challenges that India is facing in Northeast at the time, the Near East, sorry, at the time?
Yeah. So firstly, I mean, this debate about Nehru being this idealist or realist. I think this debate has been settled for some time. This is a man who's he's practical. He's a practical man and a man with vision, right? In his view, this whole idea of Pan-Asianism, Afro-Asian unity, and non-alignment, they are absolutely not in any tension with India supporting militarily the government of Burma at 1949, right? In fact, it's part of that strategy, if nothing else. So there are two or three things happening over here, Sandeep. First of all, India has just become independent, and India has witnessed a lot of violence during that process. And it has realized that in 1948, when Burma became independent in January 1948, some of the issues of issues around what kind of a union Burma will be remained unsettled. Right? India got lucky that it signed this accord, the Haidari, accord with the Nagas, where the Naga question effectively was pushed by a decade to 1957, that we'll decide the status of Naga communities in the Union of India after 10 years. But that kind of a conversation really did not take place in Burma at that point in time. And Burma enters a civil war almost at the same time as it becomes independent in some sense. So there is a government in Rangoon led by UNU, who's a democratic, individual. He believes in parliamentary democracy in that sense at that point in time. He believes in a constitutional project. And this is a worldview which is very similar to that of Nehru, that we are a new state, we are a very poor state. Burma experienced huge amount of devastation during the Second World War, especially during the Japanese retreat. So how do we keep this union together, especially when you have armed communities of kind of ethnic minority communities, the Kachins, the Karens, who are armed, and the communists are very
Mm.
expressing their politics in a very kind of violent fashion. There was serious question marks about whether the state of Myanmar, as we know it today, and as it existed since 1948, there was a serious question mark in early 1949 whether it will survive at all. And there was a two-front kind of onslaught. One was coming from the Karen communities, the Karen nationalists, who were much more potent, and the communists, the CPB, right, who were primarily recruiting from the north of Burma. Now, Nehru had a choice to make that either you stay aloof, and Burma is important at that point, a lot more important than it is today, because Rangoon is one of the most important economic kind of junction, the Rangoon port for the Union of India, right? For India itself.
Mm.
So you have huge economic equities. You have the population of Rangoon is about 50 to 55% of Indian heritage. So there are huge links. So you have huge stakes. So either you remain aloof and let this play out, or you intervene, right? And that is when Nehru decides that, look, the costs of staying aloof are too high. We need to intervene, and we need to intervene in a military fashion now. This is the first kind of military intervention that India made. It offered 125 tons of offensive military weapons to the
Mm.
government of Burma. And there were two reasons for this. One, to protect the state of Burma and its integrity, its sanctity from this kind of communist nationalist, current nationalist onslaught, but also to protect UNU as a fellow ideological co-ideologue in the constitutionalist project of the mid 20th century, which would become an alternative to like the European nation state model, right, where there's one nation, one state kind of a equation in multicultural societies like that of Burma, and to protect UNU not just against these adversaries, in terms of communists and the Karen, but also from his own military. Now, we know that the military junta is a very important political player in Burma. That was the case in 1949. Nehru wanted to empower UNU, sorry, in relation to General Navin, who was the vice chief and who had become the prime minister in 1949. Effectively, in Indian view, this was a modified military dictatorship already. So you need to protect your ally, UNU. So this is why there's a political purpose for that. And it's interesting that the advice Nehru gives to UNU is that, look, we're giving you a lot of weapons. We are also working with Pakistan to support you in this. Pakistan was on the same boat. They wanted the government in Burma to kind of survive. So was London, of course. The Commonwealth is important. He says that, look, if you have to choose, you must choose one enemy at a time. You can't fight all your battles at one go. So we're giving you weapons, we are giving you money, but you have to choose who to tackle first. And I would advise that you tackle the communists before you tackle the Karen nationalists. The Karen nationalists, however angry they may be with you, they are your potential allies in this kind of union project, a multicultural federal union project of Burma. But the communists are not, because they're ideologically opposed to you. And having seen, by communists had won in China by that point in time, of course, officially Mao will become the chairman, the premier a few months later. But there was a genuine fear in India, for Nehru, that the core threat to the viability of India at that point in time was not communal violence fanned by either the right-wing Hindutva elements or kind of Islamist elements in the neighborhood, even though that had led to partition. The strategic threat to India post-partition or post-independence India at that point in time was from the communists. And the fall of Burma to the communists could empower a lot of Indian communist movements, which were also kind of taking very important expression and shape and mass appeal at that point in time. So he was very clear about this intervention and why it needed to happen, not just for military purposes, but also for political purposes. Of course, the story turns out very differently a decade later. But in that moment, India succeeded in supporting Burma and making sure that Burma survives as a viable state.
And I think UNO acknowledges the Indian contribution, and even in his memoirs, I remember, and the two, as you said, end up UNO and Nehru end up forging a very close ideological partnership. They are together also, even in the Bandung conference, working as a 1-2 team, as a tag team. But then, despite this close relationship, In Burma, Navin takes over in 58 to 60, and then finally in a coup in 1962. And you have this shift from a very pro-Indian leader to a leader who is very, if not outrightly hostile towards India. And that's something that is a story that keeps on playing over and over again in India's Near East and in your book. So how does Nehru deal with that? And what kind of pattern does that set to for India's policy to deal with these kind of problems?
See, Nehru's response to the 1962 coup, as much as to the 1958 sort of interregnum, let's call it that, it was a
Mm,
soft coup in some senses as well, was to just deal with the reality of what you have with you. I think that's where the real kind of true Nehru speaks out, that here is a man who has ideals, but he's not letting perfect be the enemy of what you have, or the good, or even at times the bad. That if you have to deal with what you have, you cannot change the situation on the ground yourself in Burma. You live with it and you try to figure out what you can do. You maximize the gains in a limited setup. What we do need to appreciate, Sandeep, is that by the time 1962 happens, India already has a good measure of Navin. I mean, India had a good measure of Navin even before. Even if Navin was wary of Indian influence or even of Chinese influence for that matter, right? Navin is just a very insular person, and that will become the destiny of the country in some senses after 1962. Uh, Navin realizes after, when he comes to power in 1962, two things have happened. Navin himself has warmed up to the idea that if and when he takes on power for a longish period of time, he needs to work with international, especially regional partners, both China and India. And the 1958 to 1960 period, the 2 years when he was in power, with agreement of UNU that, okay, I'll step aside as the civilian leader because of a lot of insurgency and a lot of instability, and you come in and run the country. He has already tasted power once before. This is the military leader, right? I mean, this is the rehearsal to the actual coup in 1962 in some senses, rehearsal of governance. It's a you can call it an internship of sorts, with true
mm,
power and governance. And he built a relationship with Nehru, he built a relationship with other Indian interlocutors. And what he showed to the Indian counterparts was that, look, because I have control over both money and gun, and all the political parties are trying to kind of work around the parameters that I will set as the chief, uh, I can get things done much quicker than any civilian counterpart of mine can. In some senses, the Pakistan issue, right? India
mm,
faces a similar dilemma that if you really want to talk, anything, if you want Pakistan to deliver anything, it is the military establishment till today. It was the case, especially after the 1958 coup. A similar sort of a dynamic has developed. So, and UNU himself has become very insecure as a political figure by now, right? Because of Navin's assertion of power. So he realizes that his relationship with Nehru is not giving him enough domestic political dividend now in 1959, 1960 to outmaneuver Navin the way it did a decade ago in 1949, 1950. So he actually takes a much sharper pivot north towards the Chinese. And this
mm,
does not go down well with Nehru, right? And this is also a time when UNU shifts away from the more kind of secular constitutional project towards advocating Buddhism as the state religion. Now, Nehru's choice is that, look, if you want to deal with Buddhist nationalists who are non-democratic, then might as well work with the junta who at least gets things delivered than working with the civilian prime minister whose at least one hand is tied. And that dynamic is really what defines Nehru's approach towards Navin. That, look, we will deal with the junta, and the reason for that is simply that the Naga insurgency in India by that time has really taken off. Right, 1956, 57 is when the Naga insurgency kind of really sparks that scale. And to deal with individuals like Angami Zapufizo, to deal with his network of rebels and the various rebels that are crossing over from Indian territory, Nagaland, going into Burma, going at times to China from Burma using that route, you need the armed forces of Burma to work with you in this kind of counter-insurgency environment, right? UNU cannot support you. You need Navin for that. So these are the two or three practical considerations which will guide Nehru, but also the fact that UNU was not the ally in 1962 for India. in a political sense as he was perhaps in 1949 to 1952 period.
No, and I think this is one of those stories that really highlights the connection between the Northeast concerns and how that is changing and how that is having an impact on the foreign policy and vice versa. Um, and how I think also these practical concerns in some way are in clash with the ideological consideration that they have in New Delhi. But let's move on to the East Pakistan story, which again, I think that one of the important contributions that your book makes to the conversation, which is that I think that generally the thinking is that the 1971 Indian intervention and then the creation of Bangladesh was mostly contingent and kind of driven by the immediate events that were happening at the time. But you demonstrate that there was a history to it, and there was a kind of a maturing of this idea that conceivably Pakistan can be broken up in New Delhi. So, where does that story start? How does that idea come about?
So that idea in different shapes and forms and to very little effect existed right from 1947, right? India, I mean, many Indian nationalists were not reconciled with the partition to start with, not just of East but also of West Pakistan. So I mean and they felt that East Pakistan is arguably, or East Bengal as it was then called in the early years of post-independence, was arguably you have a stronger case for reunification or unification, right, than with West Pakistan. So that narrative, that idea, you can see Nehru kind of trying to tell fellow Congress leaders in 1949 that, please, I appreciate where you're coming from in terms of doing things that would get East Pakistan back into the Indian fold, but now is perhaps not the right time for us to do it. So those conversations, to some shape, they exist. Even though Nehru is not very enthused, he does not put his weight behind that idea because he wants to focus on what you have right now again, right? When the language movement in 1952, where Pakistan goes through this process where Liaquat Ali Khan is pressing, and other political leaders have been pressing for the past few years to make Urdu the national language. That is really the undoing of Pakistan in some senses, right? It's still reeling with those kind of pressures. That really kicks off a language movement in East Pakistan and East Bengal that you cannot take away Bengali, the language and the culture, from us. And arguably, Pakistan had a case to make. Simply because you got more demographic weight thanks to East Pakistan. The population of East Pakistan was larger than West Pakistan. So the Bengalis the Bengali communities of Pakistan, united Pakistan, then felt that they are being shortchanged. They have got a very unfair deal thanks to this partition. Even in economic resources and access, all the goods are going to West Pakistan, and they're just kind of giving away. It's the narrative then was that East Pakistan is a colony of West Pakistan, truly. This movement really kind of sparks up the idea in some quarters in India that maybe there is something more to it than just an idea. And Nehru is still not interested. What would change Nehru's mind in terms of not really picking up a very offensive posture towards East Pakistan and kind of liberating it, but to at least not rubbishing this idea of there is a separation and something can be done about it, or looking at the regime type in Pakistan differently, are the 1954 state assembly elections or assembly elections in East Pakistan. The first time Pakistan held a democratic exercise after independence, in 1947 for Pakistan, was in 1954, was in East Pakistan. And here's the rub. The Muslim League, the PML, the Pakistan Muslim League, they lost that election comprehensively. The United Front, made up of local Bengali leaders of different political outlooks, right? Especially led by the troika of Fazlul Haq, Hossein Sohrawardi, and Maulana Bhashani. They really sweep those elections. This is in February, March 1954. And this really makes Nehru think that, look, a change of political guard in Karachi, where a Bengali prime minister supported in a coalition by Bacha Khan, the Pashtun, both of whom, these communities, the constituencies, are fairly well disposed towards Nehru and India. They don't want Kashmir to be the kind of dispute that exists, that it is. He thinks that this is a moment when this is a revolutionary moment of sorts, and India can actually settle its conflict over Kashmir in particular with Pakistan, with a Bengali and a Pashtun at helm of Pakistan rather than a Punjabi leadership, which is quite, militarized Punjabi leadership, to be sure. And that hope is really brutally kind of extinguished in some senses. 3 months later, in May 1954, when martial law is imposed, and this very kind of newborn government led by the United Front in Bengal is basically, the leadership is jailed. A lot of their kind of student units and Dhaka University and other university spaces are important political kind of sites for activism, and there's a huge crackdown against that idea. This is what disillusions Nehru with Pakistan and its regime. He's like, this is, you cannot deal. This is not the constitutionalism that these guys are promising. Till then, there was this hope that Pakistan will also become a constitutional republic like India. 1958 coup by Ayub Khan really buries everything. And I think that is really the birth of this idea that East Pakistan and West Pakistan have irreconcilable sort of differences, even though independence is not happening very soon. In 1960-61, one of the individuals who was a junior minister, I think, in this 3 month long government, 3 month short government, was a man called Mujibur Rahman. He secretly enters India through Agartala, and he sends a message to Nehru in 1961 that why don't you arm what we call the Bangladesh Liberation Front, the BLF, arm it militarily, and we'll fight for the independence for Swadhinta Sangram in Bengal. Nehru is kind of now quite old. He's quite focused on China and other issues. He's like, I don't want to do this for various different reasons. But that idea gets stuck somewhere in the Indian system. And this is when, I mean, when Indira Gandhi would come as prime minister in 1967, and Nehru, she would support that cause much more robustly, right? And leading up to 1971. And there's a very interesting quote, and I'll stop after that, or a speech that Nehru gave, his last speech a month or two before he died in Parliament, where he said that, look, there's a new leadership emerging in East Pakistan, which is not willing to play by the rules that the old guard of political leaders in India and in Pakistan have set. They have their own ideas, they have their own kind of ways and means. And my suggestion to my Pakistani counterparts would be pay heed to what they are saying, because there could be a lot of, turbulence and tumult and violence if you don't address these issues. And that's exactly what happens over the next decade.
Um, so you bring up the story quite forward, but if you could also briefly talk about this idea that the concern that starts building up in India after the 1962 war and 1965 war of two and a half front, and that kind of leads into the 1971 war in some ways. So
I think that's one of the most defining. I think that's the defining feature of India's decision making. And that's where I depart from the argument that this was all contingent. Partly, look, yes, it is contingent insofar as no one could have guaranteed success with 1971 for India for liberation of Bangladesh. So in that sense, it is contingent, but the idea has deeper roots. And India actually took measures, right? The Intelligence Bureau took measures. RAW was created in 1968, RNAW, Research and Analysis Wing, expressly to first of all deal with the Eastern question in some senses, right? So there's a very proactive thinking and not just reactive thinking on India's part, even though the big picture debate is split between whether to keep it united and change the political leadership to a Bengali Pashtun leadership, going back to Nehru's thinking, or to dismember. Now, the 62 defeat, which from China, and the 65 was kind of shock when Pakistan is really exploiting your weaknesses at that point. That really is a defining feature for India's strategic calculus in the sense that now India has realized that you are facing two conventional adversaries who are coordinating, who can jointly harass you and hurt you. And there was a reason for that, because in 1965, China did kind of operationalize some of its units on the boundary areas between India and Pakistan, increasing India's fears as to where this will go. Will we supposed to be fighting two countries together? And not only in a conventional battlefield kind of format, that kind of war, but both Pakistan and China were working together to covertly arm and train at scale a lot of the insurgents in northeast of India. The Nagas were getting training in Nanking, right? And the Mizo movement, the Mizo insurrection happened in 1966, led by Pulal Denga. But of course, Lal Denga had started, he had taken the gun after the Maotam, the famine in Mizoram in 1960, and the person to give him the gun was the ISI, right? So there is, and India is aware of that. The Indian intelligence knows what's happening, right? So India is realizing that not only the Nagas, but even the Mizos have been armed by the ISI secretly. So you are fighting both conventional and subconventional warfare with two of your large neighbors, and you cannot have that kind of heat on all frontiers. So then the planning is that, okay, what is the easiest, relatively the easier kind of aspect to handle? You cannot kind of, you can not change the government in Pakistan directly. You cannot change the government in China, of course. You can fight them if war comes, but you don't want to enter a war either because it's not healthy for you. So what do? Is you need to figure out the half element of that is to make sure that at least your northeastern flank domestically is relatively stable, if not entirely secure. And for that, you need to do something about East Pakistan because that is the staging area for Pakistani operations and Chinese operations. And given the Cold War dynamic, even the Americans were quite happy to kind of, operate in some sections over there. So you basically say that, okay, now we need to take a call. Do we go for dismemberment or do we go for a political change using electoral means? That is when the 1970 election is the tipping point in some senses. The debate keeps on raging. India has the option of running an insurgency long before the 1970 elections actually took place in East Pakistan. They were already training units, the Intelligence Bureau was operational, RNAW was operational, there were officers who were dealing with these issues, and they were less coy about supporting Bengali nationalism if they felt that the Pakistanis are, quite actively supporting the Naga and Mizo nationalists in a kinetic manner. But 1970 elections and the fact that the government of Pakistan really did not respect the people's mandate at that point, just like 1954. And this is where you can see the difference of choices made by the father and the daughter. Now, I think the debate settles very firmly on the side of those who are saying we need to dismember because or run a very long insurgency and drain Pakistani resources. The DP Dhar is the man, chosen man, the man of choice by Indira Gandhi in terms of running the war, and he is effectively the guy who fought India's war and guided India's war in East Pakistan. Yeah, and I think that debate shifted after Operation Searchlight in March 1971. That there's no going back now. You have to. In fact, I would argue that the March 71 Operation Searchlight settled even the tactical debate of whether you'll run a long insurgency or a short war and intervene militarily towards the second option of by December, we need to go in.
Yes, this is a fascinating episode and goes on not just till the war, but after the war and how you describe how India loses the peace. And I wish we could go get into all of it, but then we would just re-narrating the book. Moving forward to 1990s and look east and major shift that happens. I think the economic aspect that comes in and this idea that we need to connect the connectivity, which still remains one of the primary ideas that in Northeast, connecting Northeast to these countries and creating some kind of an economic activity there, development idea there. This very interestingly you point out has been an idea that has been kicking around for a very long time. And it is to a certain degree a very obvious idea.
Yeah.
But still it is not something that they are able to execute. And one thing that you begin your book with is that today India and the other two countries are more disconnected than they were at the time of independence. So why is there not this movement forward in connectivity issue?
See, the idea of connectivity, just to kind of, thank you for pointing that out. The idea officially, I mean, unofficially, the idea was always there, right? I mean, officially, the idea took form in 1968 when, Indian officials, senior officials, cabinet ministers were saying we should probably think of connecting northeast of India for developmental purposes to the Saitwe port in Arakan or Rakhine, as it is known today in Myanmar, and to Chittagong port, or have access to that. And similar debates are happening today, by the way, exactly the same debates. And of course, at that point, the idea was then Pakistan would want its two wings to be connected by rail routes or something through Indian territory. And of course, the politics of these ideas was such that none of this actually took shape. And of course, Bangladesh would be created in 1971. The fact that this idea is exactly what became Look East policy in 1991, led by then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, in a very different context. World looked different, India looked different in 1991. Then became Act East policy in 2014, when the idea is still the same, Sandeep. That's the beauty of it. The
Yeah.
idea is exactly the same as it was envisioned in 68. The fact that it has not succeeded in that sense. There are two reasons. Firstly, I should acknowledge that India has succeeded in building a port in Saitwe, right? India does have access to the Chittagong port. Uh, India has built a lot of roads and rebuilt bridges and kind of rail connections with Bangladesh, especially over the past kind of decade during the Sheikh Hasina's kind of regime, not since its collapse. But this has always been a story of setbacks, more setbacks than success in some senses. Part of it is to do with India's own decision making and efficacies and capabilities. But part of it is also because of the politics on the ground in these countries, right? Things that are beyond India's control. So, first, I would identify one of the hindrances is the fact that when India did have the capability and the political space to build these infrastructural projects, either bureaucratic delays or technical kind of skill gaps or capability deficits at times that really stymied progress. This is the Myanmar story is a classic case, especially starting, let's say, 2008 to 2021 coup. That was a window where things were quite stable broadly speaking in Myanmar, and India could have really gone aggressively in building a lot of the land kind of trilateral highways and all the things that India wanted. But for various reasons, it did not deliver. And that created a lot of angst in Nepido, saying that, look, we are open to you, but you're not doing. Partly also, this is a period where there is security issues on the Indian side of the border in northeast, in Manipur and Moreh. There's, if not necessarily insurgent violence, there's political turbulence. So the capability question and the political questions are not really meeting on the Indian side, even though Myanmar is open. And then, of course, post-coup Myanmar enters another civil war situation over the last 4 years. So even if now you have more capabilities and political will, you cannot do it because of the situation on the other side. Bangladesh is a similar story, slightly different insofar as India really capitalizes on those 15 years, more or less, of when Sheikh Hasina is in power from 2009 to 2024, right? It really starts to kind of invest huge amounts of money in building connectivity projects, in rebuilding all these small kind of railway lines which were basically bombed during the 1965 war, and rebuilding them between small towns just to enable local connectivity, getting access to the Chittagong port. And this is part of the larger Bangladeshi macroeconomic story that is taking off in the mid 2010s. India is very much part of that story, as are other countries like China. Uh, what India did not appreciate, or if it appreciated, felt that it could live with the cost, is that a lot of the trade that really expanded between India and Bangladesh during this period was skewed in favor of India. So the kind of trade deficit of $16 billion roughly was the total trade, of which Bangladeshi exports to India was just 2 billion. The rest were Indian exports to Bangladesh, 14 billion. That's a huge asymmetry. It's good for Indian business, but it's really, really not good for Bangladeshi business. And Bangladeshi economy is standing on two legs. One is remittances coming from abroad, and second is the ready-made garment industry, which is an export-led industry, right? For a country which kind of is really taking pride in it being a key exporter of RMG to Western markets, suddenly having a huge trade deficit with its immediate neighbor, it became a political flashpoint. And I think it would express itself in various different shapes and forms over the last year after Sheikh Hasina would be out of power. So I think this mismatch of political cycle, mismatch of capability, intent, and delivery sort of mechanisms, but also the contradictions or the antinomies of actually doing trade with your neighbor. the official
Right.
antonyms, for the lack of a good term here, that is really a defining feature of the contradictions that continue to limit connectivity. And finally, look, I believe that, we can come to it later perhaps, but there is also the politics of India and Bangladesh and Myanmar has become very exclusionary. You cannot expect strategic geo-economic unity while also fostering social division. That just does not match. You cannot say that I don't want people moving across borders from Bangladesh to India or from Myanmar to India, whether it's for opportunity or fleeing risk or conflict in their home countries, but I want more connectivity. The two things just do not work. That's I think that's the biggest learning for me as far as this whole journey was concerned. That the politics often is militating against your policy imperatives.
Yeah, and you bring that out very well in the book. In fact, I think that coming to the present day, the two factors that you think are that you bring out in the book as now playing out importantly are China and Hindu nationalism. I mean, they have always been there in the background, but now they've really come to the fore. So I think there has been a lot of discussion about how the Chinese factor is working in this region, but how is the Hindu nationalism and rise of Hindu nationalism in India, how is that interacting with this
I
region and
think
the challenges?
No, thank you for asking that question, Sandeep. Firstly, let me acknowledge that it was not as if the Congress governments before 2014 did a very successful job at keeping this keeping this geography united. I think in some senses, the 2014 to 2019 period of the Modi government was actually pretty successful. If you look at it, they went ahead and said that we want to bring the entirety of Northeast under the so-called, the Hindu nationalist umbrella. It's the Parivar, right? And we want to work with, of course, the Muslim question is a different one, but we want to work with states which are Christian-dominated states, effectively, right? Especially Nagaland. There are huge, sizable Christian minorities in Manipur, in Mizoram, in Meghalaya. So you need to work with them, although there are social friction and there are, all sorts of the politics on the ground is, of course, fractious at times, but you don't want to other them in that sense, right? They're part of the union. And that was they built contracts, literally social contract, the political contract that the BJP governments also had with, whether it's the Kuki outfits who are now fighting, who have been fighting with the Methi outfits for the past kind of, year or two. Uh, they were much more accommodative. I think that story of Hindu nationalism, or that idea of expressing power in a much more blunt way, I think that is the story of 2019 to 2024. And I think there are two case studies in that sense to which really kind of brings it into sharp relief. One is, of course, the implosion of Manipur. Now, of course, I would be very loath to say that Hindu nationalism is the only cause. It's not. This is a very fragile state. It has been a fragile state for a long time. Uh, but the fact that a lot of the kind of engagement that the government at center and at the state level had done with the non-Methi communities, especially in South Manipur before, that the fabric of that completely came apart in May 2023, is a case in point that there was a sense of overconfidence where the state government in particular really went with under, took some decisions which were unhelpful in terms of dealing with sizable minorities at the level of the state, right? So that's one thing which you can see very clearly that it did not work. And I do believe that the government at the center appreciates as much. They have taken decisions, since to rectify it, and it's a long process of healing, I hope. And the other thing is Assam. Assam's politics has become very, very polarized over the last 5, 6 years, right? The whole idea, the policy of pushback. We are hearing reports where people are literally physically being pushed back. Who these people are, I don't know, but they are being called, allegedly they are Bangladeshi nationals. At gunpoint, they're being pushed back at times. So that, and the political discourse of the state has also taken a very sharp kind of political turn of a particular kind. So you can really see that, the electoral dynamics and the ideological dynamics of India's kind of nationalist moment or Hindu nationalist moment or expression today are really shaping not just the domestic politics but also how India deals with Bangladesh and Myanmar. There is, India is not only working with the junta in Myanmar today; it always has since 2021, but also there is at a political non-state level synergies between how Hindu nationalists would view Islam and Christianity and violence and acceptance of, and resistance to statehood of both the Union of India and Union of Myanmar, and that of the Buddhist Sangha or the Buddhist nationalists, right? So you can see those kind of synergies, political ideological synergies, even though the relationship between Hindutva and political kind of Buddhist nationalism is an uncomfortable one. But there's a common enemy of sorts in that sense. And with Bangladesh, you can see over the last year, India's approach towards Bangladesh has been very, very circumspect, right? There is a very deep-rooted fear that the collapse of the Sheikh Hasina's regime, thanks to that student movement that took place, that has not really brought any political or any strategic dividend. In fact, it has brought a lot of risk as far as India is concerned. And it is true that the larger shift towards the Islamic right in Bangladesh is a new reality. The students have formed a political party which is much more conservative. This is not like 1968 France, where a very progressive student movement is taking place against. This is actually a conservative student body, which is trying to figure out which shade of Islamist kind of politics it wants to kind of really practice here, and has a very fractious view, relationship with India, and a very kind of particular view about India as of today. So back to as where we were, social divisions and strategic kind of geo-economic unity, it just does not go hand in hand. And we have seen for obvious reasons, the despite building all these connectivity projects, today India Bangladesh trade has actually dropped because they have both sides have actually stopped exports and imports through certain entry points and certain exit points over the border. So this is unfortunately the story. We are in a phase of setback. Hopefully that'll change.
Yeah, I must although credit you about this. I think the book came out before fall of Sheikh Hasina, and you were very prescient in terms of warning the overinvestment that New Delhi has done in Sheikh Hasina, and that's that part of the story. But and I think this is now that we have come to the present, this is a good time to end. So I want to end with a last question. Um, it is a story, if you see on a long term, a story of, as you say, of suboptimal outcomes and a lot of setbacks and failures. And how much of that do you think is just the cards that were dealt geographically and politically here, or how much of that was coming out of New Delhi's choices? Because I imagine from a policymaker's perspective, I know that as a historian, I've heard you say that you loathe to give specific policy recommendations. But thinking about how much of this is out of your control or how much of this is within your control, thinking about that, I think would be a helpful way of thinking about policy.
No, I think it's, as I said, it's a bit of both, Sandeep. I think, again, as I said at the start of this conversation, giving accurate analytical weight to domestic choices and processes versus external kind of choices and processes. It's a difficult task, and I can do it only credibly based on specific issues at a different point in time. One thing which I would say to this particular response is that, look, when is it that India succeeded? Let's look back at this history and see when was uh, conflict at its lowest, relatively speaking. When was connectivity at its highest? These were not moments when, whether it's this government, central governments in Dhaka, in Naypyidaw, New Delhi, Islamabad, or Beijing, when they were too invested and too focused on pushing a particular policy or political line. It was when all the states realized with a degree of humility that there are local interests, there are local processes, there are local actors, you have to respect them. You have to give them the due respect, right? You have to protect them. You have to kind of make an enabling environment for them to practice their customs, for them to kind of engage, express, their politics using peaceful means, democratic means within the constitution of India or any other country, and then perhaps do cross-border business. These are the moments when you can see, in the late 90s when India has really experienced a lot of violence and it's starting to sign all these ceasefires with different groups. The mid 2010s, when you can see that there is a particular kind of peace that has emerged outside of India, both in Myanmar and in Bangladesh, where Sheikh Hasina is yet to take a very authoritarian turn, and so is Myanmar, right? It's still a fairly relatively open space. Even the Rohingya issues is a separate kettle of fish in some senses. Uh, the more the state loses that sense of humility, uh, the worse the situation becomes in this region. And this can be said about honestly any part of the world. This is one of the most commonsensical things to say that look, uh, be accommodative, at least to your own constituencies, to your own citizens, than to outsiders if you can't. If you see risk with Bangladesh, let's say today, make sure that you're building a politics of inclusivity in northeast of India, because it's easier again to foster division for electoral reasons than to build those intercommunity relationships, which is ultimately much better and will make India more secure. Honestly, I mean, good relationship between the Methi and Kuki communities, or Methi, Kuki, and Naga communities in Manipur, is the ultimate guarantor of India's security and well-being and prosperity. Let's say in Manipur, forget everything else, than anything else that the state government can do by deploying a lot of forces. So that's my learning. Again, it's easy for me as a historian to say this. When you're taking those decisions, it's difficult, and I do, the stakes are very high when you're taking those decisions as well. So, not all of the decisions that India took, which led to kind of real pushback, so to say, were not all ill-intended either. And this is where the idea of antinomies really kicks in. Well-intended decisions can also have really, really ill effects if they're not thought through properly.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. We were chatting with Dr. Avinash Paliwal, who has his new book, India's Near East, New History. Thanks to Devyani Chaturvedi, Mohammad Yusuf bin Yaqub, and Harpreet Kaul for putting this podcast together. You can learn more about ISAS on our website or various social media platforms. And we'll be back next month with another of these podcasts. Till
Thank you,
then,
Sandeep.
bye.